This, the NCOIC rapid response capability. I put this chart up to begin with when we started this morning, so this is what we were asked to do. Leverage industry best practices. We brought the industry members together. We asked them what were they doing, what the thought process was, and what were the practices. We've documented those, and we put them into our document. Protect geospatial data. Now, you notice I put a check mark, and then I put a plus or minus or nothing next to it. This one we put a minus. Craig Lee identified the fact that we've got a framework for geospatial concepts supporting the cybersecurity of the geospatial data. However, we need more work on that one. That one is a terrific framework, but it needs more depth. Manage bandwidth in a challenged environment. Now, there's two factors that we addressed. We understood that you need connectivity in order to get to the cloud. But we also found out that you can lower the data footprint. In other words, you don't have to pull as much data out. Let the cloud hold it. Let it stay there. Also let your applications reside in the cloud. So you're no longer using higher bandwidth for that kind of thing. So you're lowering your data footprint and allowing that to take place. Also, you have different methodologies of getting back to the cloud, but you still need to be able to get back to it. So we basically said, yeah, we addressed it, but we addressed it only within that framework. We didn't go out and turn around and say what kind of systems you need to get the communication systems you need to hook in. Ensure geospatial data consistency. That was probably a plus. All of the groups worked very hard together to identify what are the practices used to ensure that you have access to this and you're able to share the data. And that was a theme throughout the entire operation. International collaboration, again, a theme throughout the whole operation. How do we go about accessing this? And every single member, from the industry infrastructure team to the security team to each one of the application providers, looked at making sure that this was enabled to support an international collaboration. So that was a big plus in that. And then finally, backward compatibility. We kind of left it as neither a plus nor minus. It enables backward compatibility, but we really didn't work on ensuring everything was backward compatible. It just was, I can't say too hard to do, but it just never hit that point where things just seemed to be, there was not a backward compatible issue is what it really amounted to. So everybody was looking at the data. Can you access the data with the application you have? Now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to rehash how the infrastructure and the capabilities of the infrastructure.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. So typically, information technology has been a thing that you have to do. But in the past, it's been about physical, taking hardware, taking software, taking people, and putting them in a location and putting it together, installing applications. Well, cloud changes that whole calculus, right? But not just a cloud, but the ability to federate clouds via a cloud service broker approach. I showed you that you could actually build a very capable infrastructure, IT infrastructure, in minutes. And you could build it anywhere in the world. And you can use that infrastructure to support your activities, whatever's needed. Today, we talked about supporting humanitarian assistance, disaster response. While you're sitting there on the beach, drinking your beverage of choice, the rest of the world could actually create the management framework, identify cloud service providers, identify cloud service brokers, identify the roles that need to be done in order to respond to a global emergency, identify what type of applications that you need to bring. You can actually build and create those applications and then store them so that on a moment's notice, you can press a button, deploy the virtual data center with the applications, and they're up and running in minutes. today you saw how if you had an earthquake or a major catastrophe, a global organization like NATO or the UN could actually have a contingency plan that can create a geo-cloud capability. And this can be deployed anywhere in the world, essentially immediately. You can, before it happens, identify the countries that are willing to bring their capabilities. You can pre-register these countries, pre-register the applications, ensure that they're interoperable, leverage the concept of virtual organizations with identity and access management so you can manage the data and the services. NGOs, one of the biggest lessons learned was the lack of pre-planning between government organizations, military organizations, and NGOs. Why not have this GeoCloud available so that you can do exercises with NGOs ahead of time? In this case, NATO organizations could also participate in these exercises. The importance of social media can be brought in. The different virtual organizations and communities of interest can be supported. This is a different approach. This is a modern approach. This is a virtual approach to a real problem.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. All right, just to kind of recap once again, the operational benefits that I think we observed today is that the collaboration, and Kevin just talked about that. I think that this approach is the way that we're going to finally achieve that collaboration in an effective, timely manner. And we're not dictating specific tool sets, per se, in order for that collaboration to occur. Because we're using the cloud, people can use their preferred tool sets, and we'll make sure that the collaboration occurs. I also think that what Kevin's talking about as far as the exercises go, to me, if we don't take this cost-effective approach to have an infrastructure to collaborate and test it out, we're really missing a huge opportunity. And like I had mentioned, I conducted this exercise in Africa for the West African forces moving into the UN mission in Mali. And I could see what we could do with this kind of approach to train these forces. A lot of what they do is focused around disaster preparedness and dealing in humanitarian crises. And we can offer this to them with all this capability for a fraction of the cost of what it's taken us to achieve the various systems that we have here in the United States. One of the things that I also wanted to highlight that is a constant problem is displaced personnel and keeping track of them. And with all the tool sets you saw today, think about how everybody could be feeding into that and providing some awareness about where people are, and then you could once again also leverage that local personnel, that knowledge, much more effectively through some of the things that were demoed here today. The military did make progress with Haiti, and they did use some of the social media tools, and it did assist, but for the most part, once again, it was just pushing out some important information. It wasn't, the military wasn't receiving and using it. And this right here, what we've proven today is that we can kind of close the loop in a very fast, efficient manner, and on top of that, validate the data and who has given us this information, because obviously without that validation occurring, it's going to prevent us from taking action. And I think we've addressed all those things that would, prevent us from taking this quick and decisive action with the data that we're presented with. Tip?
With most programs, the industry, you take a look at the programs, and in government, you look at a program, and they always say three things: cost, schedule, capability. Pick two. Well, What you saw today is a put-go program. How about cost? Low cost. I go back to my lab interoperability. Thought it was pretty successful. We cut it down to 6 weeks, down to $300,000. $300,000. We're not even talking a fraction of that for this particular operation. You know, $3,000 a month, 6 months, $18,000, $20,000 versus $300,000. Not even the same world. Schedule. You saw Kevin build the infrastructure. So I build it right here today. He put it together in 5 minutes. Now, obviously, it wasn't as robust, didn't have all the details on it. But if you think about what you're doing, you can do this fairly rapidly. And then plugging in the application providers, the different capabilities that came in. Took a little longer. And you're going to need a framework to make that happen. So the bottom line is your cost, schedule, and capability is dramatically improved all the way across the board. Now, under the schedule, I put the line that says require some preconceived thought. What it amounted to is when we started this, you know, the concepts were in place. What we needed to do as a team was look at those concepts and decide how we approached them. How do you go about building the infrastructure? How do you go about putting the security around that infrastructure? And then how do you go about plugging in the services? What we're going to end up with is a framework that allows that to take place. So somebody can take a look at that and eventually put these things together. But if you started from scratch, your biggest problem would be how do you go about putting these things in sequence to make sure that it all works together? And that's basically what we've ended up with today. The rapid response capability is going to become a process and a pattern. We're putting that pattern together. What you're seeing is rapid infrastructure development, and it's global in capability. Now, when I say global in capability, you know, we used U.S.-based systems here. Europe has the same systems over in Europe. Australia has the same systems in Australia. So it isn't a U.S.-based concept by any stretch of the imagination. If you wanted to recreate this thing, the same process, you can go to Europe and recreate it. You can go to Australia and recreate it. You can go to Asia and recreate it. There are organizations out there that give you this capability. Security in an unclassified environment. That kept bubbling up all throughout this whole operation. How do we ensure that the information that we have is from who we think it is? And that's where Dr. Craig Lee addressed that and started putting a framework in place to allow that to take place. Because it all became very obvious when we put the scenario in place where you've got data from Israel and another country is not going to allow their data to go to Israel in the scenario. It really doesn't make any difference whether it's secure data, unsecure data. The data is owned by that owner of the data, and he controls that data. It's no longer a master plan that somebody's now in charge of ensuring that this data goes from point A to point B, and they put the rules in place. It's a framework that Dr. Lee put in place and his team, folks, scientists over the years, that says you control your data. You decide where it's going to go. And as long as you follow that framework, you control it, and now you have access to making sure it goes where it needs to go. That's probably the best philosophy you can use, especially when you're talking about creating a world in an unclassified environment. Because each one of the organizations works with customers in their domain, the military domain, you know, the health domain, the financial domain. Well, somewhere along the way, those domains are going to start crossing. And that information is going to have to go across those domains. And that's really what the NCOIC is about, cross-domain interoperability. And what Dr. Lee and his team put together was a concept that allows that to take place. And, of course, application integration. I put plug and play up there, and then I said, not quite, but close. It really is not quite. It almost looks like it's plug and play, but every single one of the application guys had to find some way, a little tweak here, a little tweak there, to make sure that the data actually integrated. And so we're going to put in the framework to assist that. I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect solution for it, but we've got it down to the point where it can happen fairly quickly. And then the other thing that was mentioned before is the value. The value of the application increases dramatically. Most of those applications could be run as a standalone, but once plugged into the cloud, had access to the data to the cloud, They had 10x capability. Once they started sharing that information, that application had 100x capability. And that needs to be the thought process that as you approach this type of philosophy is you didn't just build an infrastructure that was cheap. That's nice, and it's probably going to be the driver in the long run. But the capability dramatically increases completely across the board for everybody. So as a summary, as far as we can see, it's a new way of doing business. The operational impact, it addresses real-world situations. It addresses real-world problems. It's not an esoteric issue. It isn't an intellectual issue. It really is a capability that's moving forward. And then it's global in direction. And that actually is the theme that we as a community need to keep in mind. When there are no longer islands of countries, locales and stuff, everything we're doing these days, it's got global impact. And we're also bringing in other domains into this global environment. A lot of times we talk about the military domain, but you realize the military domain, the health domain, the NGOs, they're all starting to integrate together. And there's got to be some sort of framework that allows it to take place. And we believe this framework is it. And then, to be real pragmatic about it, when you get down to the bottom line, when you turn around to an organization and you say you can cut your costs 50 to 75%, that's going to drive it. It's always the driver across the board. Cost, cost, cost. And once you get that cost factors, you realize that cost factor is that much lower, then you're going to see people start implementing toward that direction. I'm going to wrap up this particular session by saying what you saw to begin with was the cloud. In other words, you saw Kevin assemble the cloud, and then Dr. Lee talked about securing the cloud. We brought in the participants. We plugged them in. By the way, I want to remind everybody, everything you saw up there was operated off the cloud. This wasn't somebody's PC in the back plugged into the screen. It was users reaching into the cloud, pulling out their applications, putting in data in the cloud. So everything was done today off of the cloud that Kevin built. And then finally, we access data that we put in the cloud, and we put data back into the cloud. That was our demonstration. Now I realize, I'm just narrowing it down, but that gives you a perspective of what you saw today. And the whole idea behind it is it increases the capability, the ability to rapidly assemble something. Now remember, I started off talking about the lab interoperability demonstration, and I said we got it down to 6 weeks and $300,000. Now I was pretty proud of that. But let me tell you, you just saw the whole thing done today. It wasn't done in 6 weeks and $300,000. You're talking $3,000 to $5,000 a month that we put together in hours, and then we put the framework that allowed all this to plug in. Now, what we still needed to do is put the framework in. All of us working together put the framework that said, how do we go about putting that process? When we're done, we're going to have a pattern, and it's going to go into our library and says, this is what it is, and it's now accessible to the world. Thank you very much, everybody.